So every year I like to do a tier list in the midpoint of the season, ranking all of the drivers. And this kind of gives me an idea of kind of how they've changed from my rankings from the start of the year, and then again at the end of the year, how they may have risen or fallen since then. As per usual, I'm saving this till the very last minute during the summer break, but I've been crazy busy with the move. Hasn't been fun. Wild story. Basically, we found a house to move into, had that all set up, ready to go to pick up the keys, find mold in the basement, have to get out of that lease, then have to find a new house within a month. I had to basically pack up all my stuff within a week because I'm currently within a few hours of flying to Toronto to see my friend and then on to Newfoundland to go to my friend's wedding. Anyways, let's get right to it. Alrighty, so here is my tier list. 5 tiers: standout, good, mid, poor, and leave. Get out. Shout out JoJo. So, first up is Daniel Ricciardo, and Daniel's going in mid. I think if you would ask me where I would rank him after 6 races this year, it would probably be more into poor, but he's definitely upped his game recently and has been much closer to Yuki's level since about China, which is when he had swapped the chassis. He's been struggling a lot with qualifying, and so on the races where he's able to qualify well, he's really shown how good his race pace is. And we saw that in Canada and in the Miami sprint race. But when he qualifies poorly, which has been about 80% of the time, he hasn't really been able to do much. So I think if Daniel can figure out that qualifying pace, I think he can set himself up for a better second half than he's had so far. Next up is Yuki, and Yuki I'm actually going to throw in good. I think Yuki's had a fantastic season. He's been kind of the best of the rest for a lot of these races. I guess him and then the Aston Martins kind of in that spot. And yeah, he's gotten points at a majority of the races this year. Yeah, Yuki's also outperformed Daniel in qualifying, and I think that's a big reason why he has outscored him so far this year as well. But they are very close in terms of races now. We'll see if this changes by the end of the year, but I think Yuki has definitely had the upper hand on Daniel so far. Next up is Max Verstappen, and I don't have a solo Max category this year because he hasn't quite been as dominant as usual. However, he is still in standout because until Belgium, he had been the only driver who has had multiple race wins this year. And that is the reason for why he has the championship lead that he does. He was extremely dominant the first 6 races while that Red Bull was still looking to be the best car, but once McLaren and Mercedes and occasionally Ferrari caught up to him, he hasn't quite been able to be as dominant as he has been in past seasons, but it's definitely a result of the car and his team than his driving. I'd say he's maybe had a few races where the errors have started to creep in a little bit more though, but I do think that in past seasons you might have seen an error from him here or there, but since he had such a heavy advantage, it didn't really impact him. But now that it has kind of tightened up, you're seeing these errors creep in, like Monaco, where he didn't qualify very well, Austria, where him and Lando had that collision, and then Hungary, when he was trying to make up for his team's bad strategy and crashed into Lewis. But he's also had races where he's outperformed the car, in particular Imola and Britain, where I think he probably should have finished behind the McLarens in those races, but Lando being Lando just made a few too many mistakes. So, well, Lando and McLaren made too many mistakes. Okay, next up is Kevin Magnussen, and K-Mag is going into leave get out. In the races that Kevin has been okay in, he's been okay. Like, he hasn't been qualifying all that well this year, but he does seem to have a bit more race pace than his teammates sometimes, and so is able to make up some of those positions during the races. So he has finished in 12th, I think 5 times so far this year, but that stretch of races between Saudi and Monaco, where he was just driving like an absolute sociopath and just was not making good decisions when it came to overtaking. And that behavior just completely tanked his ranking for me. I don't know what was going on with him in those races. He's calmed down since then, so I don't know if that was kind of the period where Haas had put a little bit of pressure on him to perform better so that he could maintain his seat, or if they had told him during that period that he wasn't going to get re-signed. I don't know what was going on, but Kevin was just out of control. And yeah, he just hasn't been able to qualify very well, and his teammate Hulkenberg has just been outclassing him in qualifying, and it's causing him to finish ahead of him in the races as well. Speaking of, I'm going to put Hulkenberg actually into standout. The last like 2-3 races haven't been all that great for him, but before that, he had been incredibly consistent and had 5 P11 finishes and 5 points finishes. And he's just been able to do things with that Haas car that I don't think any other driver that they've had in the past has been able to do. I think it's really made me respect Hulkenberg a lot more. I think I was kind of only familiar with him from his one season racing alongside Daniel, where Daniel absolutely demolished him, but he is a quality driver and he's definitely proving it this year, so I think he deserves to be in standout. Next up is Lance Stroll, and Stroll's going in mid, just behind Ricciardo, kind of like he was in China when he rear-ended him, which is kind of the main reason why I'm putting him here. Lance frustrates me to no end because he just doesn't take accountability whenever he has a poor race, and it always seems to be the fault of the team or the other drivers, and Lance never really wants to say that he was in the wrong. And I think that in order to improve as a driver, you have to recognize when you are making mistakes so that you can learn from them and grow. And Lance just doesn't do that. However, he has been outperforming Alonso a lot more this year. I think there was a stretch there where he had outqualified him several races in a row, and so for that reason I don't have him in poor, but he still has a lot to learn in F1, and it's always just frustrating him taking up a seat at a good team that is supposedly getting Adrian Newey now, and yeah, he's just never gonna leave, but he's also, I don't think, ever going to do much more than what he's done so far in his career. So forever in mid. Next up is Pierre Gasly. And Gasly, I'm also throwing into mid just behind Ricciardo. Gasly was having a shockingly under the radar poor season up until about Monaco, and then he had that little spat with his teammate, and I think the kind of tides changed direction in Alpine and he became to get a bit more favored in terms of the race strategy, and he's been much better since then. But yeah, just the start of this year just wasn't qualifying very well. Esteban was constantly out qualifying him, and he just wasn't able to get any points, mainly because the car wasn't that great. But in that situation, you kind of have to use the comparison to the teammate to say kind of how they're doing. And yeah, Pierre was just nowhere for the first little bit of the year. So I have him in mid. He's definitely improved since then, but yeah. And speak of the devil, Esteban is up next, and I actually have him ahead of Daniel and Pierre. I really don't know why Esteban has kind of seemed to be, people seem to think that he's been having a poor season, and I think it's mainly because the Alpine is so bad and because of that one Monaco race. But yeah, he's just been out qualifying Pierre a lot this year and doing a lot better in the races. He's had a couple of races where he's done really, really well, including Belgium, which he always seems to pull out a lot of really good overtakes at. And I think now he's probably started to be impacted by the fact that the team is probably favoring Pierre now, but he's still managing to outperform him in some respects. So I think that's a good thing for Esteban, but he is, of course, moving to Haas next year, so interested to see how that will go. But yeah, I think he deserves to be ahead of Pierre, and I have him ahead of Daniel just because even in the terrible car that he's had, he's been a bit more consistent than Daniel has. Next up is Oscar. And Oscar, I think I'm going to put in the upper end of good. I think at the start of the year, Oscar was still struggling quite a bit with tire management, but he seemed to improve that in Hungary and Belgium. So curious to see if that continues for the rest of the year or if he goes back to his ways of struggling a little bit with it. But I think Oscar has not quite had the race pace or the quali pace that Lando's had this year. But one thing that Oscar does have is that dog in him, because he does not lose race positions off the start like Lando does. He also just has such a calm head, and that's just going to serve him so well in his career. And there's no doubt in my mind that he's a future world champion. But yeah, he's got his first race win this year, even though it was kind of overshadowed by Lando's behavior in Hungary. But yeah, just very impressive driver, and I'm very excited to see what he does the rest of the year. Next up is Sergio Perez, and Sergio is going in poor. Sergio has been so tough to place because he had a really, really good start to the season. Up until I think Miami, he was finishing on the podium regularly and still qualifying decently well. But then when the car upgrades came in Imola, he just completely fell apart, and he's been able to do absolutely nothing with that car since then. It's gotten to the point where he was nearly dropped by Red Bull going into the summer break, but was supposedly saved by Liberty Media not wanting to lose money at the Mexican GP. So we'll see if Checo manages to hold on to his seat for the rest of the year. But I would have put him in leave had it not been for the start that he had to this season. But if his current form continues, I just can't, well, honestly, at this point, I still can't justify why he still has that seat. He's performing worse than Albon did in that car at this point. So yeah, just really frustrating that he's taking up a seat at a good team, and it's definitely going to cost Red Bull the constructors by the end of the year, I think. Next up is Carlos, and I'm putting him in good between Oscar and Yuki. Carlos had a fantastic start to this season when the Ferrari was actually doing well and was kind of able to be competitive with Red Bull. He was driving so well. Just really unfortunate that he missed Saudi Arabia, because otherwise I think he would be much further ahead in the driver's standings and closer to his teammates. But he came back and immediately won Australia, and that was probably one of his best races in F1 and definitely one of his best races in Ferrari. And then I think as the car got upgraded, he kind of fell back a little bit and just hasn't quite been able to have the same pace that he did at the start of the year. But I think it's definitely been more so the car's fault than his fault. And he also had a lot of distractions going on with his driver contract getting sorted. Now that he's going to Williams, hopefully he will have a little bit more focus in the latter half of this year, and hopefully Ferrari will figure out the issues that their car's been having so that they can kind of turn things around as well. Next up is Charles, and I have Charles also just behind Oscar. I think Charles has been very, very consistent this year. He's had a lot of top 5 finishes. I think he started the year off with first 8 races of the year. He finished in the top 4 every time. But then he had that absolute stinker of a run after Monaco where he was lapped in 3 of the 4 races, which is just brutal. So that was kind of when Ferrari had upgraded their car and they just didn't really know what to do with it. Charles was making some risky strategy decisions in the wet races and it was just disaster. But he seemed to have sorted it out the last couple races, and back in Belgium, he managed to get back onto the podium after George's disqualification. So I'm hoping for better things from Charles in the second half of the year. I think Oscar has been a little bit more consistent this year, and so that's why I have him ahead of Charles at the moment. But yeah, Charles is just a fantastic driver, and I'm sure he'll get it sorted. All right, next up is Lando Norris, or as some areas of the internet are saying, Lando Nor if, because every single race it seems like he comes to the media pen and is like, if this had happened, I could have won the race. If this had happened, I could have run the race. And it's getting to the point now where I think Lando needs to work on the mental aspect of his racing, because it seems like every single race he has an issue off the start, or he makes a poor strategy call, or he doesn't quite have enough to get ahead of Max, or he loses his head battling Max. But I'm also saying all this while putting him in standout. Yeah, I'll put him behind Hulk, I think. He's had a really good season, but he's just missing that half a percentage in order to compete with Max on a consistent basis, because the fact that McLaren has won less races than Mercedes this year is an absolutely wild statement, considering where they were at the start of this season and also how McLaren has seemed to be the fastest car for several races now. It's the team aspect that's letting them down, and also Lando's temperament is letting them down. And then Oscar, I think, has what it takes, but just has that little bit more experience that he needs to get before I think he's ready to compete. So yeah, it's hard to place Lando because he's definitely been very good this year, but he's made so many mistakes, and it's just goes to show how good Max is, because Max does not make any of the kinds of mistakes that Lando does. So Lando has to improve if he wants to get to the top of this tier list. Next up is Fernando Alonso, and Nando is going to the top of mid, which has been very disappointing. It seems like Fernando signed that new contract extending him at Aston Martin, and then immediately the car's pace just fell off. And who knows if Mercedes even wanted him, but I'm sure he might be regretting not going with them in terms of a contract into the future. But yeah, he hasn't had any podiums so far this year and hasn't been able to bring that car to a good place. He's been outqualified by his teammate more often this year than usual, but Fernando's still Fernando, and he's still a fantastic driver, and so I don't think you can really drop him much further down than this. But yeah, we'll see. I'm worried that Father Time is starting to catch up with him, so we'll have to keep an eye on how things progress there. Next up is Logan Sargent, and he is also going in leave get out. It's been a bit tough to watch Logan, honestly, this year, and I feel so bad for the guy because it seems like he was given maybe 2 races this year, and then that whole debacle in Australia happened where he had to give his chassis to his teammate who crashed, and it just showed how little faith that they had in him. And then James Vowles has been actively shopping for Carlos Sainz like all year this year, and just not showing any faith in Logan. And I think that's a tough environment to try and perform in. So I don't know. It's been a rough one for Logan, but I think he just doesn't quite have what it takes to be an F1 driver. So yeah, we'll see if he lasts till the end of the year, but yeah, it's just been tough for him. His only good race was probably Silverstone, where he finished P11. Next up is Alex Albon, and Albano, I think I'm gonna put him just ahead of Lance in mid. Alex had an incredibly strong 2023 season, but I think the car has gotten a little bit worse this year, and he just hasn't been able to perform quite to the level that he did last year. He still had a few standout moments, like his overtake in Canada between Daniel and Esteban, but yeah, he's crashed a lot more this year, especially Australia. That was a very, very bad crash to have. Just hasn't been able to really put in a standout performance like he did in 2023. Next up is Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis I'm putting in good, just ahead of Yuki. Lewis has definitely come alive the last few races since Mercedes has finally managed to figure something out with their car, and he's kind of found that motivation again now that the car is good and he's able to get a race win. His performance in Silverstone was incredible, and just the emotions that he released on winning that race was just incredible to see. And I think it showed us a vulnerable side of Lewis that we don't often get to see. But before the car got good, he was having a very difficult season. It was not looking good for Lewis. He was being heavily outperformed by George, and people were starting to question if Ferrari had made the right decision switching to him versus Carlos, who had a much better start to the season. But I think now that things have started to turn around, he's been doing very, very well, and we'll see if he's able to put in a fight for the championship this year. I think some people seem to think that he might be able to make up some spots. We'll see how that Mercedes performs at some of the other tracks this year, but yeah, I think the Lewis of old is kind of back, and it's good to see him competing with Max at the front again, because those two, there's always chaos whenever they're battling. So yeah, we'll see how the rest of the season goes for Lewis. But yeah, I think I would have him much higher if it wasn't for that poor start this year. Next up is George, and George I'm putting just behind his teammates. George and Lewis kind of have the same pattern that Charles and Carlos have, where when the car is bad, George is able to do a lot more with it because of his years driving at Williams. He knows how to drive a worse car, and so he was definitely outperforming Lewis at the start of this year, but it just seems like lately he's had to make some wild strategy calls in order to compete with Lewis. And we saw that for sure in Belgium, where George definitely did an impressive job taking those tires to the end like he did, but unfortunately got disqualified. Once the car got better, he's definitely struggled compared to his teammate. And so I have them pretty equal in terms of playing field. So depending on how the rest of the season goes out, I think that will kind of show which of the two has been the better driver in 2024. Now, unfortunately, I've ended this video on a bit of a whimper because I have both Valtteri and Zhou left from Stake. Valtteri I'm putting into poor, just behind Checo, and then Zhou is going in leave get out, just ahead of Logan. It's been so tough to evaluate both of them because of how bad that Stake car is. But the one thing that you can say is that Valtteri has absolutely demolished Zhou this year in qualifying. And somehow Zhou is ahead of Valtteri in the driver's standing only because Zhou finished P11 in Bahrain. But Valtteri is just impressed a lot more in qualifying. But just neither of them have been anywhere near a points finish this year. And so it's kind of unfortunate that Valtteri might actually end up finishing P21 in a 20 driver championship. But yeah, Zhou, on the other hand, I think has been the worst qualifier this year. He has consistently finished like half a second behind P19 in some of these races, which is not something that should happen. So it's been really tough to evaluate them. And then the one good race that Valtteri had in China, his engine blew up. And yeah, it's just been a rough one for the Stake guys. So hopefully they might get lucky in one race in the second half and be able to get points, but they might be a 0-point team this year, which is never good to see. So we'll see who ends up getting that second seat there, because I don't know if anyone wants it. So that is my tier list for the midpoint of the 2024 season. So let's take a look at how it has changed since the start of this season. So it looks like the biggest movers are Fernando, who I had in third. Albon has dropped a little bit due to his poor form at points this year, and Hulkenberg has definitely jumped way up in my ranking just because of how fantastic of a season he's had. Yuki's also made a big jump up. I think at the start of the season, I had him in the category of something to prove, and I think he has proved that he deserves that seat and maybe even deserves the Red Bull seat moving forward. Bottom part of the grid is pretty similar, just a few swaps in positions here and there. Interestingly, I had Checo in something to prove, and he's proven that he is probably not deserving of that Red Bull seat anymore. That's kind of how we're looking for the driver rankings. So that has been my mid-season ranking of the 2024 F1 drivers. Let me know what your ranking is in the comments down below. Do I have anyone too high, too low? And who do you think are going to be the most improved in the second half of the season? And who do you think is going to fall off? Also, please subscribe if you've enjoyed this kind of content from me. It's not really something that I do all that often. I've had a very busy year this year, and so I'm hoping to do a little bit more of this kind of thing in the latter half of the season. See you all, not for Zandvoort, probably the race after in Monza. So enjoy the rest of the summer, and I'll see you soon. Toodles.